Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my short series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women around the world. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm the Director of Mass Atrocities and International Law and of the Gender Policy Portfolio at the New Lines Institute based in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm speaking with Meghan Bodette, the Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute, about women's issues in the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF Damascus integration in Syria. Meghan, you first came on Gendering Geopolitics 5 years ago, so thank you so much for joining me again today.
Thank you so much, Emily, for running this incredible program and featuring so many great women for this, long period of time.
So what does the SDF Damascus integration mean for Syrian Kurds and for their fight for women's freedom?
So since January 29th, when the integration agreement between the two parties has been signed, we've seen modest progress on some issues with appointments of new officials, attempts to integrate, administrative and civil institutions, and the start of a process of military and internal security integration. But there are still big outstanding political questions that have been left largely unresolved due to kind of the differences from where these two political movements come from. And one of them has been so far the status of women. So this deal text didn't make any mention of women, though there were women, involved on the Kurdish side in negotiating. And some of its provisions at first looked to be, reasonably beneficial for women. It stipulated that employees in the Kurdish administration would stay on, which would mean that, women would be able to stay in their posts. And it also didn't exclude women from integrating into military and internal security institutions. And what we've seen so far is that women have not been appointed to the senior posts that have been reserved for Kurdish figures under the agreement. The Syrian Kurdish side has nominated women. My sources say these have been rejected. The highest ranking female appointee so far is the mayor of the city of Kobani. So that's a step in progress. We're seeing that women are allowed to integrate into the internal security forces, so the police and internal security, but that they're not yet being allowed to integrate into the army. This is one of the big issues on the integration talks. Of course, the Syrian Kurds had these autonomous women's units within their own forces, the YPJ, and the groups that make up the new Syrian military tended to not have women participating in security roles. This is a sticking point. So is the future constitution and the role of women, both drafters in that process and of women's rights in it. So there are these big questions of what women can do and what protections they'll have that are still up for discussion.
You mentioned the YPJ, the women's only units in the SDF. What is the latest on the integration of the YPJ into the Syrian Armed Forces?
So YPJ negotiators have been a part of the SDF negotiating delegation from the beginning, and they've agreed to compromise their autonomous structure and join the 4 new brigades that will be created in the Syrian army for fighters that were formerly in the SDF structures under the terms of the January 29th agreement. They have at this point about 2,000 to 2,500 fighters who would seek to integrate. That is about the size, the mid-range of what a brigade in the Syrian army is, and they're willing to be split out among these brigades, with their male colleagues. They've been engaged in talks with government officials on this, but until now, the position of the new government is essentially that they don't have women in their armed forces. They didn't when they were a collection of rebel groups fighting against the regime. They've offered women in the YPJ the opportunity to join the internal security forces, which the Kurdish counter is, we already have women in our internal security forces. It's great that they can integrate. It's important to have women in doing policing and internal security, as obviously, a lot of women's rights issues, you don't call the military, you call domestic security. But they want to have women in the armed forces as well. So they're continuing to negotiate to be allowed to join these brigades and continue to do the work that they've been doing in the armed forces, for the past 12 years.
I think it's really important to remember the incredible work that these women have been doing, the integral role that they played as US allies in the fight against ISIS. And so integrating them into the Syrian Armed Forces is incredibly, incredibly important. Looking at other regional states, how does Syria's position compare on the question of women's integration into their militaries, looking kind of, at the women,
Yeah.
peace, and security agenda?
So that's a really important point. Obviously, when we look at WPS, one of the key pillars of that is participation. And oftentimes, people who aren't so informed or so caught up on this agenda think, well, in a context like the Middle East, in a conflict-afflicted context like Syria, it's too difficult to have women's participation. There's cultural obstacles, there's economic obstacles, there's this or that. But when we actually look at comparable states, that's not exactly true. So when we look at Syria's neighbors, other Arab majority, Muslim majority countries like Jordan, Lebanon, or Iraq, women are allowed to serve in the armed forces. Jordan has a gender mainstreaming strategy. They've had efforts to increase the amount of women's participation and expand the roles that are open to women. When we look at the Gulf states, which have legal systems and sort of cultural traditions that are more conservative in a lot of ways than many, segments of society in Syria are, certainly more conservative than Syrian law, we see that they've been opening their armed forces to women too, right? It was only a few years ago that Saudi Arabia allowed women to join the armed forces. The United Arab Emirates, for example, had an all-women's military academy. They have a WPS strategy that cites that. And they had a female fighter pilot who was actually flying counter-ISIS missions over Syria in 2014. And when we look at countries that are allied with Syria's new government, that have been sort of providing the most support to the new security forces, like the US, like Turkey, we see that they allow women in their armed forces too. It's kind of ironic, given the years of Turkey's war against, Kurdish armed forces, that Turkish law and the level of women's participation in institutions in Turkey is more similar to that of the Syrian Kurdish forces and administration than it is to the new government. But again, Turkey is a Middle Eastern country, a Muslim majority country. That's an example. The US is working with Syria. The coalition forces that fought ISIS, on the ground, women participated there. So by saying that women can't join the security forces, this is making Syria an outlier among regional countries, religiously and culturally similar countries, and its own allies and collaborators.
That was so fascinating. Thank you for sharing all of that about how women are being integrated into militaries across the region. I think it's really, really important for people to understand that not integrating women is actually the exception to the rule. And looking at women's participation in armed forces, what are some of the benefits of their presence, and how might this be relevant to the security environment that Syria faces right now?
I think in particular, when you're looking at the kind of threats that exist in Syria, you have this domestic insurgency issue with groups like ISIS, which has said that it sees the new government of Syria as a target, which has not gone away. You have the threat, obviously, from malign actors in the region like Iran and its proxy forces. You have many different kinds of complex challenges, a lot of actors who want to destabilize the new state. And in a country where half the population is women, and where we know that some of these extremist groups have used and continue to use women to carry out their operations, saying that women can't serve in the security forces, the armed forces, creates a lot of challenges, right? In a context like Syria, where there's a lot of cultural norms about the interactions that unrelated men and women can have, if you don't have women who can engage with civilian women, who can search women on checkpoints, who can go into homes and speak to women and children, this creates opportunities for malign actors to take advantage of that. Actually, attacks carried out by female extremists were the impetus for this increased level of women's participation in armed forces in countries like Iraq, Jordan, these regional states. You have the issue of interacting, with civilian populations as well. Unfortunately, we've seen in the past year, that some elements of the armed forces of the transitional government have engaged in sexual and gender-based violence against, in particular, ethnic minority women. Now, the government has said that it's committed to, holding people accountable and investigating these issues. And one step that it could take to lessen the likelihood of these kinds of abuses happening again is integrating women into the armed forces who can interact with civilian women in a more positive way, and can hopefully, have an impact on their male colleagues, to kind of challenge these norms. And then at the end of the day, Syria is a country that's trying to rebuild after 15 years of war and decades of a brutal dictatorship, and trying to rebuild a new national identity. A lot of scholarship has gone into the role that, service in the armed forces plays in the creation of national identity. If your ideal citizen is someone who's defended their country and you exclude women from that, you're excluding women from, participation in, ideal citizenship, right? Trying to build a cohesive state, you would want ideally to allow, all the people who want to participate in securing their country to be able to do so. So whether you're looking at, the counterterrorism side of things, you're looking at interactions with civilian communities, you're looking at the creation of a cohesive post-war national identity, women's participation is important for all of those things. And look, this is very different from a lot of the cases that we have talked about regionally, in that you have these women, they already have the frontline combat experience, they already have the military structures. They're asking essentially to be allowed to continue to do the work that they've already done, to continue to use their expertise in a, local regional context where the, armed forces that they'll be joining will be doing the same kind of, counter ISIS, that kind of task that they've already been doing, where there's no legal obstacle. In fact, if you look at Syria's constitutional declaration, it recognizes an equal right to participation in public life. And it says that all international conventions ratified by Syria have the force of law. This includes the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which has specific provisions on women's equal employment and equal public participation. So actually, Syria does have a legal framework that says that women could do this. So I think that this would be a step that could really progress integration negotiations, benefit Kurds, benefit the new government, benefit the international community, and really be a win for everyone.
Absolutely. WPS is integrated into CEDAW, that international convention that you just mentioned. So it's incredibly relevant to Syria. And just for anyone who's interested to learn more about the sexual violence being perpetrated by the interim government against minority communities, I did an episode on that topic with Dima Uda, so please check that out. Meghan, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Emily, for hosting this series again and for sharing your expertise with me as well.